Seat slid back. The year's 1988. You're a GM engineer happily working on the Buick Grand National when all of a sudden General Motors cancels the G-body platform. So what are you gonna do? You could go over to Pontiac and work on the Pontiac Firebird Turbo Coupe that absolutely nobody bought, or you could mosey on over to GMC and borrow an S10 for a few minutes. This is a GMC Syclone. It was made for only 1 year and it represents one of my favorite things. Engineers gone wild. And I mean wild with engineering, not like underwear. Like the Grand National before it, the Syclone was produced in very limited numbers, just under 3,000 in total. All made in 1991, except for 3 that were made in 1992 for GM use only for their museums and stuff. And like the Grand National before it, it is a turbocharged V6 domestic supercar in the most GM way imaginable. A quick look around the interior tells you pretty much everything you need to know here. This is a GM parts bin special. It's essentially a 4-wheel drive GMC Sonoma underneath, just with a little bit of special sauce under the hood. Under the hood lies the beating heart of the Syclone, a 4.3 liter V6 with a Mitsubishi turbo on it. No, it's not twin turboed, and no, it's not a 3.8. The concept truck developed did have a Buick 3.8 in it, just like the Grand National, because that's what they had lying around, but it was just too much effort to make it work in this chassis. So instead, they worked with what they already had, and it is pretty much untouched from the 4.3 that comes in your regular Blazers, S10s, Sonomas, etc. There's different pistons for lower compression, and they're hyper-eutectic for durability, but other than that, down to the camshaft, the engine block is the exact same. The GM part spinning continues far deeper than skin deep on this truck. The throttle body is from a TPI V8, the turbocharger is by Mitsubishi with a Garrett intercooler stuck on. The ECU is actually from a Pontiac Sunbird because it was just a part that GM had lying around that could handle boost. Oddly though, it couldn't drive a V6 from the factory since it only had 4 injector channel drivers, so despite being multi-port fuel injection with 6 fuel injectors, they're all batch fired. The net result of all this is 15 pounds of intercooled boost going through the 4.3 liter engine, producing 280 horsepower and 350 foot-pounds of torque. According to Car and Driver, that was good for a 4.3 second 0 to 60 and a 13.4 second quarter mile run at 98 miles an hour. For 1991, that's supercar fast. And it was. In a straight line, this would beat up Ferraris, which is pretty good for something you could fill up with paving stones later that day and get some work done around the house. Not only is the ECU from a turbo Sunbird, but so is this gauge cluster. Even though it looks pretty similar to a stock S10 unit, it's just a little bit wider and taller, which results in the instrument binnacle just not fitting the same as a regular S10 would. Shift knob? Yeah, that was used in everything. Mostly C4 Corvettes and early Chevy Cavaliers. The ubiquitous GM steering column also makes an appearance here. It's functional, as with most things in this truck. If it gets the job done, it's good enough. Tasked with handling all the power from that turbocharged V6 is the ubiquitous GM 700R4. By this time it had been renamed to the new GM transmission naming nomenclature, which was the 4L60. Not the 4L60E, which is electronically controlled, but the 4L60, which still has a TV cable and is renowned for its reliability. No, the opposite of that. Behind the 4L Slippy is a Borg-Warner transfer case, which transfers up to 30% of the torque to the front wheels and has a viscous fluid coupling to make sure that you don't diff out and transfer 100% of the torque in any one direction if a wheel loses traction. So you can keep going even when the going gets low friction. I've said a whole bunch about the GMC Syclone in general, but let's talk about this one specifically. This one's actually owned by a friend of mine who's had it for over a decade now, and to say that he's had a history with this platform is a bit of an understatement.
When I was young, my dad went and bought a 1992 GMC Sonoma as his daily. Brand new truck. I was 3 or 4 years old at the time, and I spent my childhood riding around in that truck until about the year 2000. My dad then sold that pickup to a kid in the little town we lived in, and he drove it to high school for a few years. Dad bought it back from that kid in 2004 when he bought something nicer so he could go to college in it. And Dad and I spent basically all of high school rebuilding the engine on it and repainting it and all the other stuff we played with. And so spending all those years in that truck, we'd go over to my grandpa's house in the kind of bigger city we lived next to. And the Syclone, this truck that I currently own, was parked in my grandpa's neighbors kind of down the street's garage. We'd go by every once in a while, the door was open and you get a peek at it, and I never really knew what it was when I was younger, other than it was just a nicer and cooler version of what my dad drove every day. And I remember we got internet. When we first got internet, it was one of my first searches was, what is the Syclone? So I searched it and read about it and decided, I'm going to have one of these one day. And then, time went on, I kind of forgot about it. We'd still see it every once in a while in the garage, but never assumed I could actually ever own the thing. And I was 19 years old, and we went to the gas station in the town I live in to, buy gas. And there was we have a local magazine here called Wheels for You that people used to list cars for sale in. It's kind of dead now. But I picked one of them up because I always did. And I flopped that thing open, and first page I opened to is Syclone. So I went home, told Dad about it and asked if we could go take a look, and Dad said yeah. And so, I called the guy, and while I was on the phone with him, I asked him where he lived, and sure enough, it was the same truck that I had seen all these years. The truck the only one I'd ever seen that, even piqued my interest and made me even realize they exist. So we went over there and managed to buy the thing from him in 2008. And I've owned it 12 years now. Left it stock. I bought it with 48,000 miles on it. It has about 69,000 and some change now. This is 12, 13 years later. That's about it, I think.
Fellas, ladies, if you live where it's hot, you know what this is. Let's petition GM to bring this thing back. More vehicles needs this. So it looks like a truck, but does it quack like a truck? Can you actually haul things in this? Well, first off, you've got to navigate the typical GM latch failure. There we go. And then you're greeted with 500-pound cargo load capacity. And best guess to why that has to do with these leaf springs over here. You get a whole 2 leaves, probably for weight transfer reasons, to get traction on these rear tires when launching, because that is this truck's party piece. Originally, this truck didn't even really have a tow rating to speak of. If you ask GM, they just kind of say, don't do that. Eventually, they revised that and said, if you really try, you could probably do 2,000 pounds, but it's not advised. This is for hauling other things. I do love these square S10's tailgate supports. It's actual folding metal support instead of just a chintzy little chain or wire. It's kind of nice. I don't know why they did away with that. Probably the bean counters, the thing that GM's best at. Incomplete vehicle manufactured by General Motors Corp. Manufactured by Performance Automotive. There's a few more neat items of note in this engine bay. Unlike the earlier Grand National, which had coil packs sitting on a control computer, this has a computer-controlled distributor with a timing advance curve built into it, controlled by the ECU, which references boost, O2 sensor readings, etc. This entire thing is completely computer controlled to protect itself. It'll pull timing and boost if there's pinging and whatnot. The earlier Grand National was one of the first engines to have knock sensors and electronic controls to that degree, but just further refined here. Also, more examples of this car not being built by GM, instead by Performance Automotive. On a regular S10, that'll say Chevrolet, which is a bit odd. Something that's not really specific to the Syclone, but all four-wheel drive S10s, is the oil filter is right there. You got to take out the air box to get to it, and then just dump oil all down in your fender well. This is part of the inline oil cooler. The 2 lines come in and then go out to the radiator core, somewhere presumably behind all those bugs. The factory service manual for these cars has some pretty interesting bits in it. This is the Master Technician Overview. It says, Cyclones and Typhoons do not achieve a smooth idle, in quotes for some reason. This is to comply with current emission specifications. Therefore, these engines tend to run lean at idle, just like the Buick 3.8 turbo engines. And if you use too high of an octane, you'll make it worse. Here's a list of modifications that GM technicians are actually told to keep a lookout for when you bring your car in case you cause damage to it. Adjustable fuel pressure regulators, aftermarket memcals, which would be like a performance chip or engine tuning, reduction pulleys, which are also known as underdrive pulleys, an aftermarket air cleaner, which this actually has a K&N panel filter, but I'm not sure if they're talking about that or just an entirely different induction system. Hot injectors, which is a really weird way of referring to oversized injectors. Exhaust, this does actually have an exhaust. Originally these had two side-by-side outlets at the back, but those blew out, so it got replaced with a single exit system, which was both cheaper and a little bit lighter. Just like the service manuals, the owner's manuals are split into regular Sonoma and Syclone specific, and on page 9 is one of the most engineer things I've ever read. This was clearly written by someone who just knew no one was going to read this. The turbo engine in your Syclone is a little noisier than a regular engine because it has a low restriction intake and exhaust system that are needed for maximum power and torque. After heavy acceleration, you'll hear a rushing sound. This comes from the turbo engine and is normal. If your Syclone is idling, you may hear a whine or hum when you're standing near the rear of the truck. This is normal. The noise is from the fuel pump mounted inside the fuel tank. Also, you may hear a slight whining noise when the engine speed increases. This is coming from your turbocharger. This is also normal. Someone was made to write this, and someone knew their work would not be appreciated. That is the most sarcastic bit of official GM literature I've ever seen in my life. That's absolutely hilarious. Also recently, Hot Wheels came out with this casting of the GMC Syclone, and naturally the owner of this has about 7 of those. The parts bin is alive and well. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then Performance Auto Systems.
And that is a 2-piece wheel where the center section is produced separately and then welded up in the middle of the barrel, and it kind of gives this weird effect of it being a detachable hubcap. Can confirm there's a weld in there. You can get it in any color as long as it's black, and as true as that was for the Model T, it also was for the Buick GNX and the GMC Syclone. A few were later stripped and repainted red as Marlboro Special Editions, but they all left the factory in black, and all basically identical with the exception of just a couple options. You could get that GMC badge in black, you could get or not get the Syclone on the windshield that is actually factory, and you could get a CD player or no CD player. This one has an aftermarket head unit, but supposedly it was originally a CD player car, which is neat. Though the sheet metal is 99.9% S10, these flares are unique to the Syclone. There was the GMC Sonoma GT, which had flares, but they did not have this upper cladding along the doors, and this flare was different. It just kind of went straight down to these ground effects. It's a pretty neat look, very 90s, and the fitment is very GM. Like on close inspection, you might think that this truck's a little bit beat up, but no, they just came like that. It was the 90s. Stop interrupting me. Sounded good. So the party piece of any all-wheel drive turbo car is the launch. I'm in the passenger seat. I've never been in this truck when it's actually launched properly before. The process is real difficult. And here we go. I've launched Teslas before, and the non-performance models can't touch that. Nothing this old should leave like that. That's ridiculous. And that's stock.
All right, to launch a Syclone, I start out, set the parking brake, and the normal hydraulic foot brake is a little weak. Put it neutral, rev it just a little bit, and if you notice, when the engine's coming down, you get just a little more vacuum than you would normally, which helps get a little more pressure at the brake calipers. Brake's all the way set. It goes into drive, not overdrive. Put your hand on the parking brake and just mash both pedals until it starts to creep, and then let it all go. And that's 60.
Driving the Syclone's a little weird because I've never driven a non-Syclone square body S10, but if the rest of them drive anything close to this, they're way nicer trucks than I actually thought. This thing feels solid, and the visibility is amazing. I can just look over my shoulder at whatever I want, and it's all right there. It's sort of the famous trivia piece about this truck that it's faster than a Ferrari, but the important distinction there is that that's straight line speed. When you get into the corners, things are a bit different because this is still a four-wheel drive S10 underneath, even if it is lowered. The suspension geometry just isn't there. It starts to get a little surprisingly planted in the corners, actually. It's not near as bad as I expected. This actually feels far sportier around a corner than its G-body brethren, the Grand National. Brethren might be a bit of a strong word. Distant cousin, maybe? But if we go into what passes for a corner here in Kansas, I mean, it's not an autocross champ, but dang, that's a lot better than I expected. I mean, I expected it to drive like a truck, and this is far more car-like than I was anticipating. Overall, the driving experience is very smooth. The V6 is smooth. The suspension is a very good compromise between... GM clearly did a lot to not make this feel like a truck to drive. It drives like a car. It's soft enough to be fairly comfortable. It's flat enough to not feel like you're going to tip over around corners. It's very well thought out overall. The transmission, too, for a 4-speed slush box, I mean, it kicks down quickly and smoothly, and a lot of that comes down to, in older trucks, the TV cable not being stretched or maladjusted, which probably has colored quite a few people's opinions on these unfairly, just due to lack of maintenance. But just driving it around, it feels perfectly dailyable. If you get on it a bit in a straight line, ooh, it picks up. Wow, that's only 3,000 RPM. It doesn't kick down, it doesn't rev out. Redline's 5,300.
No.
It starts at 5. It starts at 5.
It shifts at 4,400 RPM.
It won't rev above that? And it's one of the only implementations of this transmission that will shift into overdrive at wide open throttle, because it will get through all those gears in the quarter mile, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild.
You get to about the 1,000 foot at the drag strip, and it needs 4th gear to finish the pass.
Oh, it's good at highway pulls. It's very good. Not a ton of turbo noise. You really, if you weren't listening for it, probably couldn't tell that this car is turbocharged. Just if you got in it not knowing what this was. I mean, there's a turbo boost gauge, which is pretty, it sort of lacked some of the drama of the Grand National, which was, of course, modified. I don't think they're anything near as loud as that stock, but it was a constant barrage of turbo noise and chatter and exhaust and all of it at once. This feels downright refined, and from what I've been around of 80s supercars, like, people give American interiors a bit of an unfair rap. Go sit in an old Lamborghini. Go find yourself a Countach and tell me that it has a good interior. It's not. It's garbage. Fiero kit cars, they're not that far off reality. Corner. Man, it turns in all right even. Okay, so...
And then you put your hand down there and pull when you release the foot brake.
Foot brake release, not the hood release. Okay, so put my foot on the foot. So I've got my foot on the brake, hand on the foot brake release, because the main brake is mostly acting on the front calipers due to the brake bias. Foot brake is helping the smaller rear calipers because it is all-wheel drive with most of the torque going to the back. So I've got my foot hard down on the left. There's a truck behind us, so let's go. We've spooled up and... seat slipped back. That truck thought he was gonna go around us. Okay, now I can't reach the pedals. There we go. What the heck? That's the most GM thing ever. That is the most General Motors. Yeah, we built this really fast truck. It launches so hard that our seat sliders can't take it. You know, what are you gonna do? Build better seat sliders? Nah. That'd add 15 cents to each unit. Can't do that. There's not a single rattle in this truck. That's amazing. No suspension, no interior, nothing's creaking or squeaking. This has 69,000 miles, so it's not like used, but for something, cars that go this fast are usually exotics. And I've driven enough exotics to know that a 70,000 mile exotic is done for. It is used up. Half the stuff in the interior is not going to work. Everything's going to squeak and rattle. I should put this back in overdrive. Stuff's going to start falling off. This is a supercar that you can own and drive and not worry about any of that. If a door panel falls off, I can buy clips from Goodwrench. The parts binning is the beauty of it, because I can get parts absolutely, that Goldwing is going for it. I can get parts anywhere. Glass, no big deal, it's everywhere. Everything that you would need to replace can be found at your local O'Reilly's. And there's not a supercar, new or used, on the market that you can go and get parts at O'Reilly's for. This is something special, and it's something special for not a ton of money, depending on condition, depending on, there's not enough of them out there to really get a hardline value on what you're going to pay for one. But somewhere in the mid-20s isn't completely unreasonable, and for what you get, that's a pretty solid deal. You'll be the only person on your block with one for sure. It's a lot more interesting than a Corvette. Overall, the GMC Syclone represents some of the best of GM, when the engineers were allowed to have their pet projects with minimal interaction from the bean counters, though still present, obviously. Can't have your cake and eat it too, but the result did keep it cheap, and that means that they're out there and they can be bought and they can be serviced. And what you get is really something special. Thanks for watching.